The penthouse on the top floor of a glass tower in Manhattan named Sky Haven was so silent it felt suffocating. The early morning sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting reflections on the marble surface of the dining table, where a lone platinum wedding ring lay, gleaming like a reminder of something lost. Beside the ring was a carefully folded piece of paper, elegantly handwritten in black ink, with the recipient's name inscribed, James. The steady ticking of the wall clock, a minimalist design worth thousands of dollars, was the only sound breaking the silence, as if time was counting down to an inevitable moment. James Carter, CEO of Carter Tech, stood frozen in the expansive living room. A sharp-featured white American man with dark blonde hair, neatly combed steel blue eyes that typically masked all emotion, and a bespoke suit clinging perfectly to his tall frame without a single wrinkle. In the business world, he was known as a cold tech genius who had turned his grandfather's small company into an empire rivaling Silicon Valley giants. But this morning, James was not the powerful CEO in the boardroom. He was a man facing something he had never prepared for loss. His hand trembled slightly as he held the letter, a rare sign of vulnerability, never seen by board members or the security team. The same long fingers that usually skimmed through data sheets or signed million-dollar deals now clutched the paper as if it were the last thread keeping him from falling into the abyss. He reread the words, each sentence etched into his mind like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. James, I have fulfilled my part of the contract. Maya's treatment is progressing well, and the doctors say she has a chance at an everyday life. I am more grateful for that than words can express. But I can't keep pretending this is just a transaction, not when my heart has invested too much. You made it clear from the beginning that feelings had no place in this arrangement, and I respect that. That's why I'm leaving before I lose myself in this setup. Thank you for everything you've done for Maya and me. I hope you find what you're genuinely looking for, even if you haven't realized what that is yet. Ava Thompson, the woman who had entered his life as part of a business agreement, was now gone, leaving nothing but the ring and those final words. 28. A Black American woman was once a promising literature scholar with warm brown eyes and a smile that could thaw the chill of any room, including Sky Haven. She wasn't just his contract wife. She had become the one who made him question the walls he'd built around his heart. A wave of panic, foreign and uncontrollable, erupted in James's chest. He had never experienced this before, not during billion-dollar negotiations, not in the face of competitors or boardroom pressure. The letter slipped from his hand, drifting to the cold marble floor. He rushed to the elevator without thinking, jabbing the button repeatedly, as if that could rewind time. The doors slid open, and he nearly collided with the security team waiting in the lobby. Sir. The head of security, a former military officer with a keen gaze, looked at James with concern. James, who usually appeared impeccable. Neatly combed hair, straight tie, composed voice, now looked like a man who'd just run through a storm. His suit was rumpled, his hair disheveled, eyes wild. Find her, James commanded, his voice breaking a sound so unfamiliar even to himself. Find Ava. Check the medical center and the Harlem library, and call her sister Maya. Find her right now. The security team exchanged glances, but none dared question him. They were used to James's precise commands, but had never seen him like this. The team leader nodded and immediately spoke on his radio. We're starting now, sir. Where might Ms. Thompson be? James shook his head, fists clenched. I don't know. Just find her. As the security team dispersed, James stood in the vast lobby of the tower, light from the glass walls, reflecting the image of a man unraveling. He remembered the first time he met Ava, in a luxury restaurant in Midtown, where she sat across from him with challenging confidence. Your time is valuable, Mr. Carter, but my sister's life is worth more, she'd said, her eyes unwavering. Back then, he thought she was just part of the plan, a solution to a legal problem. But now that she was gone, he realized she had become irreplaceable. 6 months ago, it had all started as a simple transaction. James's grandfather's will required him to marry before the first anniversary of his death to retain control of Carter Tech. Ava, drowning in medical debt due to Maya's heart condition, needed money to afford an experimental treatment. A contract was drawn up, 1 year of marriage, separate lives. No emotions, with $5 million for Ava. James had thought everything was under control, like any other deal he had handled. But Ava, with her intelligence, pride, and questions that made him confront himself, had upended it all. The early autumn wind swept through as James stepped onto the streets of Manhattan, his eyes scanning the bustling crowds. He didn't know where Ava was, but one thing he knew for sure. He couldn't let her disappear from his life. Her letter, now crumpled in his suit pocket, wasn't just a goodbye. It was a challenge for him to face what he had refused to admit, and to prove he could be a man worthy of her heart. At that moment, James Carter, the man who once believed everything could be solved with money or power, realized some things couldn't be bought. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to fight for it. 6 months earlier, in a luxurious law office in Midtown Manhattan, sunlight streamed through large windows onto a walnut conference table where a thick stack of documents lay waiting. The atmosphere in the room bore the solemnity of a multi-million-dollar deal. But this was not a merger or acquisition. This was more unusual, a marriage contract between James Carter, CEO of Carter Tech, and Ava Thompson, a literature scholar facing financial hardship. James Carter, 34. A white American man, sat at the head of the table, composed and cold. His steel blue eyes scanned the documents, betraying no emotion. A charcoal gray suit hugged his tall frame. His silk tie perfectly knotted, as if he were preparing for a board meeting, rather than a life-altering decision. Across from him was Ava Thompson, 28, a black American woman with neatly tied natural curls and warm, sharp brown eyes. She wore a simple yet elegant navy office dress, radiating confidence, despite the circumstances pushing her into this unusual situation. Eleanor Hayes, the Carter family's attorney for over 3 decades, stood between them, her calm voice breaking the silence. This contract is unambiguous. She began sliding the documents toward Ava. 1 year of marriage, living separately within Mr. Carter's penthouse, appearing publicly as a married couple when needed, and absolutely no emotional involvement. In return, you will receive $5 million, half upon signing and half upon completion. Ava didn't reach for the documents right away. She looked directly at James, her gaze unwavering. "Why me?" she asked, her voice firm, but tinged with doubt. New York isn't lacking people who'd sign something like this, especially for that kind of money. James, accustomed to answering questions with precision and brevity, tilted his head slightly, as if reassessing her. "You have no ties to my business circles," he replied, his voice deep and measured. "You're intelligent, discreet, and—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You have a clear motive." Ava raised an eyebrow, unable to hide a flicker of irritation. "You mean I'm desperate enough to have no other options?" She thought of Maya, her 16-year-old sister lying in a hospital bed with a failing heart. Medical bills piled high on the kitchen table in their small Harlem apartment, where she had grown up, surrounded by books and her mother's paintings. The experimental treatment at Meridian Institute could save Maya, but it was far beyond her financial reach. Not desperate. James corrected his gaze steady. Realistic. "I need a wife to meet the terms of my grandfather's will and retain control of Carter Tech. You need money for your sister. This is a mutually beneficial arrangement." Eleanor interjected, her voice gentle but professional. Ms. Thompson, we've done a full background check. No current romantic relationships, no scandals, and you can navigate high society when required. You're an ideal candidate. Ava clenched her hands beneath the table, feeling violated. A background check. Who permitted you to do that? I did. James responded bluntly, without hesitation. I don't take chances on important decisions. She stared at him, trying to read the man behind the icy facade. James Carter, the man who appeared in business magazines under the nickname the Ice King, was known for his precision and emotional detachment. But there was something in his eyes, a guardedness, as if he were always bracing for an unexpected blow. If I'm going to sign this contract, Ava said slowly, I want to hear the terms directly from you, not through a lawyer. Eleanor glanced at James, mildly surprised. James gave a subtle nod, signaling her to leave the room. Once they were alone, he began his tone businesslike, as if presenting a strategy to investors. 1 year of marriage. We live in the same penthouse but in separate quarters. You'll appear publicly as my wife. Galas, press conferences, charity events. There are no scandals, public disputes, or disclosure of the contract's nature. The $5 million will be dispersed as agreed. Ava leaned forward, her eyes defiant. And this no emotions clause. Can you put in writing that human beings aren't allowed to feel anything? James stiffened, though his expression remained composed. Emotions complicate things, he said, as if stating a universal truth. This contract exists to eliminate complications. If feelings arise, we handle it like adults, acknowledge it's beyond the scope of the agreement, and proceed. Ava gave a faint, bitter smile, though a storm was brewing inside. You make it sound so simple, Mr. Carter. But people aren't spreadsheets. You can't program a heart the way you run a company. Maybe not, James admitted for the first time, allowing his gaze to falter briefly. But we can agree to keep things professional. Can you do that, Ms. Thompson? She looked down at the documents, thinking of Maya, of the sleepless nights at her sister's hospital bedside, of the academic dreams she had shelved after their parents died in a car crash, leaving her as Maya's guardian. Harlem, where she was raised amidst community poetry readings and vibrant murals, had taught her that resilience was strength. But even resilience had limits when faced with bills that couldn't be paid. I need to meet you before I sign. Ava said, her voice firm. Not here, not with a lawyer. I want to know to whom I'm giving my life a year. James looked at her, feeling for the first time a flicker of curiosity beyond business boundaries. Very well, he replied. Friday, 7 p.m., Laurent Restaurant. I'll make the arrangements. When Ava left the office, she stepped into the bustling streets of Manhattan, surrounded by a sea of hurried strangers. She took a deep breath, the smell of toasted bread from a nearby cart mixing with the blare of car horns. She thought of Maya painting in her hospital room, her smile fragile but full of hope. I'll do it, sweetheart, she whispered, clutching the contract bag. Inside the office, James remained seated, gazing out at the New York skyline. He thought of his grandfather's will, a strange clause requiring him to marry to prove stability. Carter Tech was his family's legacy, the only thing he had left after his parents died when he was 12. He had learned to control everything, his company, emotions, and life, to ensure he would never be hurt again. Ava Thompson, with her challenging stare and sharp questions, was a variable he hadn't calculated for. But he believed he could manage her like every other deal he'd made. Neither knew that by signing that contract, they were opening the first page of a story neither one could have written in advance. The ceremony room in a boutique hotel in Manhattan, named the Ivory Room, lived up to its name, pristine, white, minimalist, and cold. No fresh flowers were on the altar, No ribbons draped across the walls, and no joyful laughter from family or friends. Only a space designed for events requiring absolute discretion. Light from the crystal chandeliers reflected off the marble floor in shimmering patches, but it wasn't enough to dispel the sense of detachment. This was not a wedding, at least not in the traditional sense. This was a transaction wrapped in the veil of ritual. Ava Thompson, 28. A Black American woman stood in a small side room looking into a mirror. The ivory silk dress, custom-made on short notice by designer Eleanor Hayes, had hugged her figure perfectly, highlighting her warm brown skin and delicate features. The designer had captured her measurements precisely, despite the rushed timeline. But as Ava looked at herself in the mirror, she didn't see a bride. She saw a woman playing a role one she had agreed to for Maya, her 16-year-old sister fighting heart disease in the hospital. Ava touched her pearl earrings, the only jewelry her mother had left her a fragile tether to warmer days in Harlem, when her family was still whole. 10 minutes later, Ms. Thompson, an assistant, called through the door, polite but emotionless. Ava took a deep breath, trying to smother the growing hollowness in her chest. "Maya deserves to live," she whispered to her reflection. "This is for her." But even that mantra couldn't fill the void. A wedding should have contained the mother's laughter, the father's teasing, or Maya's radiant smile. Across the hall, James Carter, 34, a white American man, stood in another preparation room, adjusting his navy silk tie with near-obsessive precision. His bespoke black suit accentuated his tall frame and broad shoulders, but his face, with steel blue eyes and chiseled features, betrayed a rare trace of tension. James was not easily unsettled, but today he felt an invisible pressure. This wasn't just a clause in his grandfather's will. This was a step that forced him to share his living space with a stranger, Ava Thompson, the woman who had challenged him with sharp questions in the law office days before. "You look fine," said Eleanor Hayes as she walked in, her voice carrying a rare note of humor, though a smile wouldn't hurt for the photos. James glanced at her but didn't smile. "Is smiling in the contract?" he asked dryly. "No," Eleanor replied, her eyes glinting with understanding. "But persuasion is. You built an empire by taking calculated risks." "James, this is just another one. It's paperwork in formal wear," James corrected, turning away to hide his unease. But Eleanor, who had watched him grow from a quiet boy after his parents' deaths, knew he was concealing far more. The ceremony proceeded swiftly, almost mechanically. Only Eleanor, a bureaucratic officiant, and 2 paid witnesses were present, hired to keep silent. No family, no friends, no music. Ava walked down the short marble aisle, her heels echoing in the still space in sync with her quickening heartbeat. She walked alone with no one to give her away, a symbol of the independence she had forged since becoming Maya's guardian after their parents died in a car crash. James stood at the front, tall and commanding in his suit. But when their eyes met, Ava saw a flicker of surprise in his. Not warmth, but recognition, as if he saw her not merely as a clause in a contract, but as a woman standing before him, carrying her own story. That moment passed quickly, buried under his familiar, cold expression. The officiant, a middle-aged woman with a flat voice, read the words of unity and commitment, but they rang hollow in the vacant room. Ava barely heard them, focusing instead on James's hand as he retrieved the platinum ring from his pocket. His hand, usually steady as he signed million-dollar deals, trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Their fingers touched, and a sudden sharp jolt passed through Ava's body like a current. She looked up, catching a flicker in James's eyes, gone just as quickly as it appeared. "With this ring," James said, his voice even but rigid, as if reading a script. When the ritual called for a kiss, he leaned in, and their lips met in a brief procedural gesture. But something that lingered, a slight hesitation, a barely audible breath, made the kiss last a second longer than intended. They pulled back abruptly, as if startled, or burned by something outside the contract's boundaries. As they exited the ceremony room, a discreet black car waited outside. But despite all security precautions, a small group of paparazzi had gathered. Camera flashes burst like fireworks. "Mrs. Carter over here," someone shouted. "Mr. Carter, when did you two meet? Is this a marriage or a merger?" James tensed his shoulders, stiffening, eyes sweeping the crowd with visible irritation. Ava, sensing his discomfort, acted instinctively. She gently took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his reassuringly. He looked down, surprised, then met her eyes. For one moment, amidst the flashbulbs, they looked like a real couple, not two strangers bound by paper. The photographers captured it, unaware that what they had witnessed was a performance and something more honest than they could understand. The two sat silently as the car pulled away, taking them to the Meridian Institute, where Ava would visit Maya. Ava gazed out the window, her fingers resting on the new ring, heavy, unfamiliar. James stared straight ahead, trying to suppress the unease that the kiss and her touch had stirred. They had signed the contract. Everything was supposed to be clear. But when the car stopped outside the hospital and Ava turned to thank him for arranging a private room for Maya, James nodded without a word. He didn't realize that a small crack had formed in the wall around his heart at that moment. The Sky Haven penthouse, perched atop a glass tower in Manhattan, was a marvel of modern design. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls revealed sweeping city views. The white and gray minimalist decor, arranged with near-obsessive precision, and not a single item bore a personal touch. To James Carter, 34, a white American and CEO of Carter Tech, it symbolized control, a space that reflected his perfectly arranged life. However, to Ava Thompson, 28, a black American woman who had just moved in after their contractual wedding, it felt more like a museum than a home. Ava stood in the wing, designated as the East Wing of the penthouse, a suite of rooms, including a main bedroom, study, and private bath. She set her small suitcase on the marble floor. Inside were a few favorite books, a painting by her sister Maya, and a wool blanket her mother had once knitted. These items looked oddly misplaced amidst the soulless perfection of the space. She touched the glass wall ice-cold beneath her fingertips and gazed down at New York, a sea of twinkling lights, as distant as the man she had just called husband. James said, "This is your access code," appearing in the doorway, his voice even and professional. He wore a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up, yet exuded authority. 2809. The security system will register your biometrics tomorrow morning. He pointed toward the hallway. The kitchen is fully equipped. The chef comes 3 times a week, but you're free to cook if you wish. Ava nodded, trying to hide her sense of overwhelm. "Thank you," she said, her eyes scanning the space. "It's immaculate. Functional," James replied, misreading her hesitation. "You can redecorate if you like within reason." She looked at him, searching for any trace of warmth, but found only his familiar distance. "Is there anything personal here?" she asked, half joking. James stiffened slightly, a flicker of something crossing his eyes. "Function over sentiment," he replied dryly, then turned away. "I'll be in the West Wing. If you need anything, contact Eleanor." When he left, Ava sat on the too-perfect bed, feeling more like a guest in a hotel than a wife. She opened her suitcase, pulled out Maya's painting, a Harlem sunset with red brick buildings and an old oak tree and placed it on the nightstand. "Just 1 year," she whispered as if trying to convince herself. Ava began exploring Skyhaven the next day, leaving slight traces of herself throughout. She placed a few books, poetry by Toni Morrison and novels by Zora Neale Hurston, on the stark white living room shelves. A vase of fresh flowers bought from a street cart on the corner appeared on the dining table. These small touches softened the space, making it feel less like a showroom. While rearranging, she discovered a low bookshelf tucked in the corner of the living room, nearly hidden by a sleek leather chair. Inside were poetry collections, Langston Hughes, Maya Angelou, and a copy of Pablo Neruda, with folded pages and underlined verses. "I love you," without knowing how, when, or from where one line in the Neruda book was marked in pencil. Ava stood still holding the book, wondering who the man was behind James Carter's cold exterior. That evening they dined together, not by desire but at Eleanor's suggestion to help convince the household staff of their marriage. The marble dining table seated them at opposite ends, and the distance between them felt broader than the entire room. James ate methodically, occasionally glancing at the table beside him, responding to work emails between bites. Unable to bear the silence, Ava decided to break it. "What made you start with Carter Tech?" she asked, her tone light but curious. James looked up, surprised by the question. He set down his fork, thoughtful. "He said my grandfather founded the company," his voice steady and with a trace of memory. "I expanded it from a local tech shop to a global empire." Ava offered a faint smile. "Just expanded. That is a modest way of describing the creation of one of the world's leading tech firms." James shrugged, but a flicker of pride passed through his eyes. "I saw opportunities others missed. Technology is logical. It's more reliable than people." She tilted her head, not missing the bitterness in his last sentence. "And before that, did you always love tech?" James hesitated, as if the question had touched a place he rarely visited. "I started coding at 8, he said slowly. "My parents died when I was 12. My grandfather raised me and taught me about business. I took over the company at 26 when his health declined." His words were dry, but Ava sensed the grief beneath them. She thought of her own family those nights in Harlem, when her father read Hughes' poetry aloud to her, and Maya and her mother painted by the window. "I grew up with books and art," she said gently. "My parents were teachers. They always encouraged us to ask questions. Harlem is full of stories. Every street corner, every mural tells one." James looked at her for the first time and paid attention. "Harlem," he repeated, as if testing the sound of the word. "You seem connected to it." "It's home," Ava answered, "even if I live in a glass museum now." She smiled, trying to lighten the mood. James didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. He said, "You'll get used to it," standing to pick up his tablet. "I have a call with Tokyo." "Excuse me." Ava looked down at her plate as he left, feeling a strange mix of disappointment and curiosity. James Carter was a puzzle, a man who built an empire but hid poetry in the shadows. She wondered if anyone had ever truly reached him, or if he had learned to live alone for too long. That night, unable to sleep, Ava wandered the living room. Moonlight streamed through the glass walls, casting everything in silver. She picked up a Hughes collection and opened it to Harlem. "What happens to a dream deferred?" She read it softly, her voice echoing in the quiet. In the West Wing, James, also unable to sleep due to a financial report, heard her voice through the internal audio system, which he had forgotten to mute. He sat motionless, listening, feeling like an intruder, but unable to stop. He switched off the sound system when she set the book down and returned to her room. But her voice, lingered in his mind. They were two strangers, living under one roof, bound by a contract. Yet moments like this, a poetry book, a question, a voice in the night, were quietly writing a story neither of them could have predicted. The annual gala of the Carter Foundation, one of Manhattan's most coveted events, took place in a grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel. Crystal chandeliers hung like suspended stars, their light reflecting off polished hardwood floors, and the sparkling champagne glasses held by elite guests. This wasn't merely a fundraiser, it was the stage of the upper echelon, where deals were whispered and reputations crafted through exchanged glances. It was an obligation to James Carter, 34, a white American and CEO of Carter Tech; to Ava Thompson, 28, a black American woman and his contract wife. It was her first step into his world as Mrs. Carter. Ava stood in the east wing of the Sky Haven penthouse, preparing for the evening. The sapphire blue gown chosen by Eleanor Hayes's styling team hugged her body and accentuated her warm brown skin and graceful curves. It was designed to be bold and refined, aligned with the Carter Foundation's colors, while helping her stand out in a sea of traditional black gowns. As Ava looked at herself in the mirror, the dress felt more like armor than attire. It's just an act, she reminded herself, touching her mother's pearl earrings, the only personal item amid the orchestrated luxury. James waited in the living room, dressed in a tailored black tuxedo, highlighting his tall frame and broad shoulders. He stood by the glass window, gazing down at the city lights, but his eyes betrayed a hint of tension, not about business, but about the crowd awaiting below. When Ava stepped out, he turned, and for a rare moment his usual composure faltered. "You look," he began, then stopped as if words failed him. "The dress suits you." Ava gave a slight wry smile. "Thanks. You look very CEO." She noticed his hand subtly clench one of the small tells she'd started to recognize after a few weeks of living together. James opened a jewelry box and held a matching sapphire necklace and earrings. He said this would complete the look, his tone returning to professional. "Society notices if James Carter's wife shows up without appropriate accessories." Ava hesitated. "I don't need anything else." But before she could refuse, James added, "Think of it as part of the role." In the limousine en route to the plaza, James sat silently, fingers tapping rhythmically on his knee, a habit Ava had seen during their stiff Sky Haven dinners. She watched him, noticing the slight tension in his shoulders, his eyes drifting to the window as if searching for an escape. "You don't like these events, do you?" she asked gently. James glanced at her, guarded. "They're necessary," he replied, as if that were a complete answer. "Crowds make you uncomfortable," Ava observed, not a question. She remembered the moment after their wedding, when he'd stiffened under the photographer's flashes. "I used to teach literature to college students. They'd pretend to be fine, but I always knew when someone wanted to flee the room." James didn't respond immediately, but his fingers stopped tapping. "I function well in social environments," he said, slightly defensive. "It's a required skill." Ava nodded, not pressing further. "If it gets overwhelming," she said quietly enough that the driver couldn't hear, "tap your left cufflink. I'll find a way to get you out for a moment." He looked at her, visibly surprised. "No need," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. As they stepped onto the red carpet, the flash bulbs erupted. "Mr. Carter, over here. Mrs. Carter, how did you two meet?" James tensed, shoulders rigid, his gaze scanning the crowd, calculating the distance to the door. Ava gently linked her arm through his without thinking, drawing him closer like a familiar couple. He looked down at her, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes, then rested his hand over hers, a small but meaningful gesture. The photographers captured the moment, unaware that it was both a performance and a sincere act of support. Inside the ballroom, polite laughter and clinking glasses filled the air. Ava could feel the stares, curiosity, judgment, and sometimes doubt. As a black woman in an elite space dominated by whiteness, she was no stranger to those looks from her academic symposium days. But tonight, she wasn't Ava Thompson, the scholar. She was Mrs. Carter, who had chosen to play the role flawlessly. James introduced her to business partners and donors, his hand lightly placed at her lower back, a gesture both polite and protective. Ava conversed intelligently about the Carter Foundation's initiatives, tech education for underprivileged children, and medical research, thanks to materials Eleanor had prepared. "You're truly impressive," one elderly donor remarked, eyes sparkling. "How did you manage to win over New York's most difficult bachelor?" Before Ava could answer, James stepped in, his voice smooth and convincing. He said she didn't have to win me over looking at Ava. I was the one who realized how lucky I was. Though it was part of the act, the words made Ava's heart beat a little faster. Midway through the event, James subtly touched his left cufflink. Ava acted immediately. "Darling, could you show me the terrace?" she asked warmly. "I've heard the city view from there is stunning." James nodded, his eyes betraying a quiet relief. They stepped onto the terrace, where the cool air and stillness offered a welcome escape from the crowd. He leaned against the railing, taking a deep breath, his shoulders slowly relaxing. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Too many people." Ava stood beside him, gazing at the city lights. "I get it," she said. "Back in Harlem, I used to read poetry at community events. Sometimes I wanted to run before stepping on stage." James looked at her, truly curious for the first time. "How did you get through it?" "Breathing," she said, smiling, and remembering, I wasn't doing it for the crowd. I was doing it for the people who needed to hear it. She paused, then asked, "What about you? What keeps you walking into boardrooms and galas?" James hesitated, then answered, his voice low. "Duty. Carter Tech is my grandfather's legacy. I can't let it fail." She nodded, sensing the weight behind his words. "But you don't have to carry it alone forever." Before he could respond, a figure emerged from the terrace doorway. Claire Carter, James's cousin, stepped out, her golden hair shimmering under the lights. "James." "Ava," she said, her tone sweet, but her gaze sharp. "What a perfect picture. But I wonder how long can you keep up the performance?" James tensed, but Ava smiled calmly, refusing to be provoked. "Hello, Claire," she said evenly. "Isn't tonight lovely?" Claire smirked, her eyes scanning Ava like a critic assessing a forgery. "Lovely indeed," she replied, then turned away, leaving behind a trace of unease. When they returned to the ballroom, a photo of James and Ava on the terrace had already surfaced online, hailing them as New York's newest power couple. But the cameras couldn't capture the look in Claire's eyes, quietly planning how to tear that perfect image apart. In the weeks following the charity gala, the Sky Haven penthouse began to show subtle signs of life. Ava Thompson, 28, a Black American woman, had quietly transformed the once sterile space into something less like a showroom. A fresh flower arrangement changed every Monday on the marble dining table. Her books, from Toni Morrison's poetry to James Baldwin's novels, lay scattered on side tables near the sofa, some open with pages marked. A deep red wool blanket, a gift from her mother, was draped over a white leather chair, adding a warm touch amid the minimalist decor. To Ava, these changes were a way to survive in a place that wasn't home. But to James Carter, 34, a white American man and CEO of Carter Tech, they were confusing signals, unsettling, yet strangely intriguing. James, who usually left the penthouse before dawn and returned past midnight, began changing his routine. He started appearing in the kitchen early in the morning, just as Ava was brewing coffee, the rich aroma filling the space. "Monday right shelf," he said one morning, pointing at the coffee cabinet, his tone steady but no longer cold. Ava, in an oversized sweater and jeans, turned around, surprised. "Thanks," she said, smiling. "Do you drink coffee or enjoy giving instructions?" James raised an eyebrow, a rare reaction that bordered on humor. "I drink it," he replied, reaching for a mug. "No milk, 1 sugar." As they sat across from each other at the kitchen counter, the silence was no longer awkward like in those early meals. Ava noticed he jogged every morning, his athletic gear fitting snugly, revealing a toned physique. "Running helps me think," James said, as if explaining his presence. "If you're interested, there's a good trail in the nearby park." "I prefer yoga," Ava responded, though she noted the unspoken invitation. "Still, thanks for the suggestion." Moments like that, small, ordinary, began threading into their lives. One evening, James returned earlier than usual after a long day at Carter Tech. He found Ava in the living room, watching a documentary on the Harlem Renaissance on the large screen. "Mind if I join?" he asked from the doorway, unusually hesitant. Ava, surprised, nodded. "Sure." "Do you like Langston Hughes?" she asked, pointing to the screen where a historian was analyzing "The Negro Speaks of Rivers." James sat on the sofa, keeping some distance, but his presence made the space feel less empty. A natural conversation unfolded. Ava spoke of her poetry readings in Harlem during college. James admitted that his grandfather loved jazz and used to tell stories about Harlem's clubs in the 1950s. Ava said, "I didn't know he'd been there," eyes lighting up. "Do you listen to jazz?" "Occasionally," James replied, voice low. "Miles Davis. It's blue." Ava smiled. "Nice choice, Mr. Carter." Their conversation lingered past the film's end, and when they said goodnight, Ava felt an unexpected warmth, as if they were no longer two strangers bound by a contract. But that closeness unsettled her. The contract had a clause, "no emotions." She wondered if she was already violating it. She thought of Maya, her 16-year-old sister undergoing treatment at the Meridian Institute, and the reason she was here to save her. Yet her heart shifted every time James looked at her with less coldness. "Be careful, Ava," she told herself, lying in bed in the East Wing, staring at the glass ceiling. "This isn't real." On Tuesday afternoon, Ava received a message from James, which was unexpected since he rarely contacted her directly. "I'm at Meridian Institute reviewing Carter Foundation funding. Want to visit Maya together?" Ava hesitated, then replied, "Sure, thank you. I'll be there in 30 minutes. At the hospital, Ava found James in Maya's room, a bright space with windows facing the garden. With her curly hair tied high and her radiant smile undimmed by her heart condition, Maya was pointing to a painting she had just finished, a Harlem street with kids playing basketball. Contract brother-in-law. Maya teased when she saw Ava, her eyes mischievous. "You said he was a cold CEO, but he's all right." In a charcoal gray suit, James surprised them both with a rare, genuine smile. "Thank you, Maya," he replied, his tone soft. "Your painting is impressive." Maya shrugged, but her eyes lit up. "I want to host an art exhibit in the children's ward. Art helps kids forget the needles." Ava looked at her sister, heart swelling with pride, then glanced at James, catching him watching Maya with evident respect. James said thoughtfully that the Carter Foundation could help. "I'll speak with the grants team." Maya raised her eyebrows and looked at Ava. "See, I told you he's not so bad." Ava laughed, but her emotions swirled beneath the surface. James wasn't just there for business. He was trying to connect. And that made her both touched and afraid. As they left the hospital, Ava thanked James for coming. She said you didn't have to do that standing beside his black SUV. But Maya was pleased. James looked at her, a gentle glint in his eyes. "She's a remarkable girl," he said, just like her sister. Those simple, sincere words stunned Ava. She nodded, unable to meet his gaze for too long, afraid her eyes would reveal too much. That night in the East Wing study, Ava opened her journal and wrote about the day. "James isn't who I thought. He has walls, but behind them is something real. I'm afraid I feel too much, and this contract doesn't allow that." She closed the journal and looked at the city lights, wondering if she could protect her heart for the rest of the year. In the West Wing, James sat at his desk, a financial report glowing on the screen but unread. He thought of Ava's smile as she looked at her sister, and how her voice sounded when she spoke about Harlem. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old Miles Davis vinyl, his grandfather's gift. As jazz filled the room, he closed his eyes, feeling like a piece of the wall he'd built around himself had begun to crack. They were still two people bound by a contract, but these moments of closeness, a cup of coffee, a film, a painting quietly painted a new picture, one neither of them dared to name just yet. In her minimalist yet luxurious office blocks from Carter Tech's headquarters, Claire Carter sat before a glass desk, her icy gaze locked on her computer screen. Her golden hair was pulled into a high ponytail, and her deep red business dress hugged her figure, exuding power and ambition. At 32, Claire, James Carter's cousin, had spent the past decade building her influence within Carter Tech's board, waiting for James to fail to meet the conditions of their grandfather's will, so she could seize control. His contract marriage with Ava Thompson had disrupted that plan, and Claire had no intention of standing by. On her screen was a photo from the Carter Foundation gala showing James and Ava on the rooftop, their eyes locked, as if no one else existed. The press hailed them as Manhattan's new power couple, but Claire saw something different, a fabricated relationship on the verge of becoming real. "They look too comfortable," she muttered, tapping her fingers on the desk. "This can't last." A knock came at the door. "Come in," Claire said sharply. A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair entered holding a folder. He was Myers, a former investigative journalist with questionable connections. "As you asked, I ran a full background check on Ava Thompson," Myers said, placing the folder down. "Nothing significant. No scandals, no bad credit, no shady ties. She's clean, a scholar who left her career to care for her sister with a heart condition." Claire frowned, flipping through the pages. "No one is that clean, Myers," she said coldly. "She has to have a weakness." "NX. A financial secret." Myers shrugged. She had a serious relationship in grad school with a professor named James Whitmore, now tenured at Princeton. They split. When she left academia to care for her sister, no signs of resentment. Whitmore's married now. He has a kid. Claire tightened her grip on her pen, her eyes darkening. "Then we'll create a weakness." She said, her voice low but resolute. "I need photos, images that could make James doubt her. She is with wealthy men in suggestive contexts. Something that makes it look like this isn't her first time doing this." Myers hesitated. "Fabricating images is risky, Ms. Carter." "If it's traced," Claire cut him off, sliding a check across the desk. The figure on it was enough to silence him. "Be creative, Myers. I want a narrative. Ava Thompson, a gold digger who targets wealthy, emotionally vulnerable men. James has trust issues. One seed of doubt is all it takes." Myers pocketed the check and nodded. "I'll handle it. You'll have your photos in a few days." Meanwhile, at Sky Haven, James and Ava continued to share quiet moments of growing closeness. One morning, Ava found a jazz CD by Ella Fitzgerald on the kitchen counter, along with a small note from James. "Give this a listen. You might like it." She smiled, slid it into the player, and let the music fill the room. When James entered, dressed in his running gear, he paused, surprised to find her swaying to the rhythm. "Not bad," Ava said, with a playful glint in her eye. "You've got good taste, Mr. Carter." James's lips curved almost a smile. "You're not bad yourself," he replied, reaching for a mug of coffee and sitting beside her. Moments like these, light and natural, made Ava wonder if she was dreaming of something impossible. But one late night, after Ava had returned to the East Wing, James sat in his private office, the pale blue glow of the screen illuminating his face. A new anonymous email had appeared in his inbox subject line. "Your wife doesn't want you to know." He frowned, about to delete it, until the attached images gave him pause. Ava, in a formal gown, laughing with an older, wealthy-looking man at what appeared to be a gala. James opened the email. A series of photos followed Ava with various men at academic conferences and upscale gatherings. The message was short. This isn't her first marriage for money. Ask about Harold Winters, Thomas Camden, and especially James Whitmore. She has a pattern she preys on the wealthy. Easy targets. James felt a tightening in his chest, a familiar sensation from childhood, when those closest to him vanished after his parents' deaths. He knew this could be fake. The timing was too perfect, the framing too tidy. But the seed of doubt had been planted. He opened a secure line and called Jenkins Carter Tech's head of security. "I need a background investigation," he said coldly. "Discreet, thorough. Start immediately. Ava Thompson, look into everything, especially the names in this list." He sent the names from the email. The next morning, Ava noticed James's shift. He avoided her gaze during coffee. His voice returned to that stiff, professional tone from their early days. "Busy day," he muttered, when she asked if something was wrong, leaving before she could say more. Ava stood in the kitchen, coffee in hand, feeling like an invisible wall had broken between them. In the following days, James grew distant, returning later and speaking curtly. Ava tried not to dwell on it, focusing instead on Maya, who was responding well to the experimental treatment at Meridian. But every time she saw James, the softness once present in his eyes when they talked about jazz or Harlem was gone, replaced by a quiet distance, as if she were a stranger. One night, unable to bear the silence, Ava knocked on his office door and entered without waiting. He sat before the screen, his face taut in the computer's blue light. "James," she said firmly, "what's going on? You're avoiding me like I'm a mistake." James looked up, his expression flickering for a moment, then closing. "I'm busy," he said flatly. "The Henderson deal is at a critical point." Ava crossed her arms. "Don't lie. I'm not your employee. If I've done something wrong, please tell me." He hesitated, his hand tightening around the mouse. The anonymous email still glowed on his second monitor, but he didn't let her see. "Nothing. Ava," he said quietly, "you should rest. I have an early meeting." Ava stared at him, pain blooming beneath her ribs. "Fine," she said, her voice calm but edged. "But if you plan to keep treating me this way, at least respect me enough to be honest." She turned and left, shutting the door gently behind her, but her heart felt heavy. She didn't know that in the darkness of that office, James was at war with himself, torn between the seed of doubt Claire had planted and the truth his instincts were beginning to feel. Ava wasn't like anyone he had ever known. Across the city in her apartment, Claire held a glass of wine and stared at the Manhattan skyline. Reed Tower Carter Tech's headquarters glowed at night, a constant reminder of the power she craved. "Just wait, James," she whispered, lips curling. The seed has been sown. Now it only needs to grow. Once slowly warmed by Ava Thompson's subtle touches, the Sky Haven penthouse now carried a tense silence. The glittering lights of New York City shimmered through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, but they could not dispel the heavy atmosphere inside. Ava, 28. A black American woman stood in the kitchen, gripping a cup of tea gone cold. Over the past several days, she had felt James Carter, 34, a white American man and CEO of Carter Tech, grow distant. He avoided her gaze, answered curtly, and returned to the penthouse later than usual. Ava couldn't bear the silence any longer. She decided to confront him, even if it meant shattering their fragile balance. James sat in his private office in the West Wing, the blue glow from his computer casting shadows across his tense features. On his screen was a preliminary report from Jenkins' head of security regarding Ava. The report confirmed the men mentioned in the anonymous email. Harold Winters was Eleanor Hayes' husband, who met Ava at an academic conference. Thomas Camden was her thesis advisor. James Whitmore was an ex-boyfriend with whom she had broken up to care for her sister Maya. As the email suggested, there was no evidence that Ava was a gold digger. But what startled James was Jenkins's note. Some photos showed signs of digital manipulation. The email source had been routed through proxies, but possibly linked to Carter Tech's internal network. James clenched his fist, feeling a mix of relief and shame. He knew he had been wrong to doubt Ava, but the seed of suspicion planted by the email had shaken him. He thought back to his childhood, to the plane crash that took his parents and left him in the care of his grandfather, a loving but exacting man. "Never trust too easily, James," his grandfather had said. That lesson had become his shield, but now it was pushing him away from Ava. A knock broke his thoughts. Ava stepped inside, wearing a loose sweater and jeans, her brown eyes sharp but tinged with hurt. "James," she said, her voice steady, "we need to talk. You've been avoiding me all week. If I've done something wrong, say it." James looked at her, his eyes wavering. He wanted to deny it, but the sincerity in her voice made it impossible. "I've been busy," he said dryly. "The Henderson deal. Please don't." Ava cut him off with his arms crossed. "Don't use work as an excuse. I'm not your employee. What's going on?" James hesitated, moving to turn off the report on his screen, but Ava had already stepped closer. She saw the subject of the email, "Your wife doesn't want you to know." Her heart sank. "What is that?" she asked, voice low but sharp. James stiffened. He could no longer hide. "An email," he said, voice heavy. "Anonymous. It had pictures of you with other men. Suggested you'd had similar arrangements before." Ava froze. It felt like the floor had dropped out beneath her. "And you believed it?" she asked, her voice trembling with anger and hurt. "You think I'm a gold digger, don't you?" James stood, moving toward her, but Ava held up a hand to stop him. "I had it investigated," he admitted, his voice quiet. "To verify. The report says the photos were doctored. No evidence investigated." Ava snapped, her eyes flashing. "You investigated me, James. Instead of asking me, you chose suspicion and hired someone to dig through my past." James's shame surged. "I had to be sure," he said defensively. "My position requires caution." "Your position." Ava echoed, her voice rising, laced with bitterness. "This isn't about your company, James. This is about us. About the moments I thought were real morning coffee jazz visiting Maya. I thought you saw me, not a contract. But clearly I was wrong." James opened his mouth, wanting to explain, but the words caught in his throat. He remembered her reading Hughes late at night, her voice echoing through the audio system, and her smile when Maya called him her contract brother-in-law. Those moments were real, but he had let doubt distort them. Ava took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Let me make it straightforward for you," she said, voice calm but sharp. "Harold Winters is Eleanor's husband. I met him once at a conference. Thomas Camden was my advisor. He fought to get me a scholarship. James Whitmore was my boyfriend. Yes, but I broke up with him when my parents died, and I had to raise Maya. I gave up my dream of becoming a professor so my sister could have a chance to live. That's who I am, James. Not a gold digger. Not a liar." She paused, locking eyes with him. "You could hire an entire security team to investigate me. But you never asked me the truth. That's what hurts the most." James felt a tightness in his chest, like the air had been sucked out of the room. "Ava," he began, stepping forward. "No," she said, her voice low but firm. "I need time. I need to prove I'm not a fraud, to decide if I can keep living like this." She turned to leave, but glanced back before walking out. "I trusted you more than the contract. I thought you did too. But maybe I was wrong." The door closed softly behind her, but the sound echoed like an explosion to James. He sat down, his hands trembling, and reopened Jenkins' report. The note about the Carter Tech internal network glared back at him. Claire, his cousin, the one who believed she was the rightful heir to Carter Tech. He remembered her cold stare at the gala, her barbed words on the rooftop. She had the motive, the means, and the ambition to orchestrate this. James clenched his fists, fury rising, but it couldn't drown out the shame. He had let Claire manipulate him. But worse, he had hurt Ava. He thought of Harlem, where she'd grown up among poetry and murals, where she learned to be resilient after losing her parents. She brought that warmth into Skyhaven flowers, books her mother's blanket, and he had repaid it with suspicion. Ava sat on the bed in the East Wing, clutching her journal. She wrote, "I thought James was different, but if he can't trust me, what did any of those moments mean? Jazz coffee, Maya. I can't live in a contract that doesn't include trust." She closed the book, staring at the city lights, her heart heavy. Maya was improving, but Ava now wondered if she was losing herself in this agreement. At her apartment, Claire received a message from Meyer's photo sent. Carter opened the email. Claire smirked, raising her glass of wine. "Good," she whispered, gazing out at the glowing Reed Tower. "Let James destroy it all himself. I'll be right here waiting." Still in his office, James opened an old audio file, an accidental recording from the intercom system. Ava's voice filled the room, reciting Hughes, "What happens to a dream deferred?" Her voice was soft but powerful. James closed his eyes, feeling the weight of what he had just lost. Something more precious than Carter Tech itself. Dawn broke over Manhattan, and the first light filtered through the glass walls of the Skyhaven penthouse, casting a soft glow on the marble dining table. But the space once slowly warmed by Ava Thompson's presence now felt silent differently. Not the cold sterility it once held, but the hollow quiet of something that had just lost its soul. Ava's platinum wedding ring lay beside a carefully folded letter on the table. Her elegant handwriting spelled one word: James. Ava, 28. A Black American woman was gone. She had left behind everything tied to the contract, taking away her self-respect. The night before, Ava had sat in the East Wing holding her journal, her eyes full of tears, but her face firm with resolve. She had transferred the full payment from the contract untouched, except for Maya's medical expenses, back into James Carter's account. James, 34, a white American man and CEO of Carter Tech, would find not anger but a goodbye in her words, unmistakably. Ava sincere, strong and dignified. James, Maya is improving, and the doctors believe she'll fully recover. I'm grateful to you for giving her a chance at life, something I couldn't do alone. But I can't keep living in a relationship that's more than a contract, but less than the truth. You chose suspicion over trust, which tells me we can't build anything real together. I don't blame you. We both carry wounds from the past. But I need to protect my heart the way I protect Maya. I've returned the money and the ring. The contract asked for a year, but I've fulfilled the public part of our agreement. I'll explain my absence by focusing on Maya and my teaching career. Thank you for everything. I hope you find what truly makes you live, not just survive. Ava stood and looked around the East Wing one last time. Her books, Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, still rested on the shelves. Her mother's wool blanket remained draped across the chair. Maya's painting is still hanging beside the bed. She left them all, as if leaving a part of herself in Sky Haven, a reminder of what could have been. With a single small suitcase, Ava left the penthouse before James awoke. The door closed softly behind her. No goodbyes. James woke later than usual, his head heavy from a sleepless night. He walked into the kitchen expecting to see Ava making coffee like every morning, but there was only silence. The ring and the letter on the table stopped him in his tracks, his chest tightening with a feeling he rarely allowed himself fear of loss. He picked up the letter and read every word, each line cutting deeper than the last. His hands shook when he reached the sentence, "I need to protect my heart." He sat down. The letter fell from his fingers. Images of Ava filled his mind. Her reading Hughes in the dark, laughing when Maya teased him holding his hand in front of the paparazzi at the gala. He thought of Harlem, where she had grown up among poetry and murals, and learned to stand back up after losing her parents. And he had doubted her, the woman who brought warmth into his cold, calculated world, all because of an email from Claire Carter, his cousin, who had always hungered for Carter Tech. James rushed to his office and called Eleanor Hayes, his family's longtime lawyer and confidant. Eleanor, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, with a calm, grounded voice, arrived immediately. She said you missed your call with Henderson, then stopped when she saw him, hair disheveled, shirt, wrinkled eyes vacant. What happened, James? He slid the letter across the desk without a word. Eleanor read it slowly. Her expression softened. When did she leave? She asked. This morning. James replied hoarsely before I woke up. Eleanor sat down across from him, her voice a mixture of sternness and compassion. What are you going to do? Do, James echoed blankly. The contract's done. She fulfilled her part. There's nothing left to do. Eleanor frowned. James Carter, I've known you since you were 12. Since you built walls so high, no one could see the hurt boy behind them. I respected those walls because I knew why they were there. But I will not sit here and watch you hide behind a contract while the one person who made you feel alive, not just functional, walks out. James stood and walked to the window, staring out over Manhattan. She gave the money back, he said quietly. Everything I did meant nothing. Or, Eleanor said gently, like what you did beyond the money was the only thing that truly mattered. She stood and placed a hand on his shoulder. You were wrong to doubt her. But mistakes aren't endings, unless you choose to let them be. James turned toward her, his eyes more vulnerable than she'd seen in years. I don't know where to begin, he admitted. Start with Maya, Eleanor suggested. If anyone knows where Ava is, it's her. James nodded, but inside him a storm churned. He thought of his childhood, how his grandfather had taught him that trust was weakness, that control was power. But Ava had challenged all that. She brought flowers into Sky Haven, read poetry in the dark, and trusted him more than the contract. And he had broken that trust. Meanwhile, Ava was driving north, heading toward Lighthouse Point, a remote lighthouse on a cliff 2 hours from New York. It was a place she had always gone to think even during college, when she was torn between her academic passion and responsibility for Maya. Waves crashed against stone. The wind brushed through her hair as she sat on a wooden bench, journal open in her lap. I've left. But why does my heart still feel like it's at Sky Haven? James hurt me, but I saw him, the man behind the walls. I need to find myself again before I can decide what comes next. She thought of Harlem, her mother painting murals, her father telling her that dignity was her greatest strength. Leaving wasn't giving up. It was how she honored herself. But as the sunset painted the sky above the lighthouse, she wondered, would James ever realize what she had seen in him? A heart worth trusting, if only he dared to open it. Back at Sky Haven, James sat with Ava's letter in hand, rereading it. He opened a drawer and pulled out the old Miles Davis vinyl his grandfather had given him, but didn't play it. Instead, he picked up the phone and called Jenkins. Please find out more about the anonymous email he ordered. His voice is steely. I want to know exactly who's behind it, and investigate Claire Carter. He knew he had lost Ava, but for the first time, he was ready to fight for her trust, not with money or power, but with a truth he had never dared face until now. Lighthouse Point stood tall on a rugged cliff 2 hours north of New York, where Atlantic waves crashed against stone in an endless, thunderous rhythm. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and violet, casting a soft glow over Ava Thompson, 28, a Black American woman. She sat on a weathered wooden bench, her journal on her lap, her natural curls dancing in the sea breeze. She had come here for clarity, just as she had during her college years, when she had to choose between her academic dreams and the responsibility of caring for Maya, her younger sister. But today, she wasn't here to decide the future. She was trying to mend her heart after leaving James Carter and the Sky Haven penthouse. James, 34, a white American man and CEO of Carter Tech, drove a black SUV along the winding coastal road, his heart pounding faster than usual. That morning, he had gone to the Meridian Institute to speak with Maya. The 16-year-old, her eyes sharp and mischievous, had looked at him like she could see straight through his polished exterior. "You hurt my sister," she said bluntly. "But she saw something in you, something the media never did. If you're going to find her, don't do it for the contract. Be real." She handed him a drawing. A lighthouse. Lighthouse Point. She comes here when she needs to think. But if you hurt her again, I don't care how rich you are. I'll make you regret it. James parked and stepped out into the salty air. In the distance, he saw Ava, small but strong against the vastness of sea and stone. Wearing a navy sweater and jeans, she looked like she belonged here, a woman who carried Harlem's stories, resilience, and pride. James hesitated, feeling like an intruder, but he knew this might be his only chance to make it right. He walked forward, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes. Ava looked up. "James," she asked, closing her journal. Her expression shifted from surprise to guarded calm. "How did you find me, Maya?" he replied, voice low. "She wanted to help you, not me." He stood a few feet away, hands in his coat pockets, trying to appear calm, even as his pulse raced. "Ava, I was wrong." Ava raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp, but not as angry as during their confrontation at Sky Haven. "Wrong about what, James?" she asked evenly. "About investigating me or thinking I was after your money." "About everything," he said hoarsely, stepping closer. "About letting doubt close my eyes to what I knew was real. About hiding behind a contract instead of facing what was growing between us. About not trusting you, even though you gave me every reason to." Ava studied him, rising to her feet. The wind carried the scent of salt and memory. "Words are easy, James," she said, voice soft but firm. "I've lived under the weight of doubt my whole life. In Harlem, I had to prove I belonged in every classroom and every seminar. When my parents died, I gave up my dream to raise Maya, and I don't regret that. But I can't be in a relationship where I must prove I'm not a liar. James felt a tightness in his chest. Her words struck with painful clarity. I know, he said, pulling from his coat pocket the marriage contract, the document that had bound them. I let this define us, but it wasn't real. With deliberate motion, he tore the contract in two, then again, and again, until the pages fluttered in the sea breeze, falling over the cliff like discarded ghosts. I don't want you to be my wife on paper. I want you, Ava, not because of a will, not because of Carter Tech, because you make me want to live, not just survive. Ava watched the fragments vanish into the wind, her heart trembling, but she remained steady. Nice gesture, she said with a hint of dry humor. But tearing paper doesn't erase what happened. I need to know you won't retreat the next time things get hard, when doubt creeps in again. James nodded. Vulnerability etched across his face. I was raised by my grandfather, who taught me that trust is weakness, he said quietly. When my parents died, I learned how to need no one, because needing someone felt like a liability. But you changed that. You brought flowers into Sky Haven. You read poetry in the night. You made me laugh for the first time in years. I hurt you. I can't promise to be perfect, but I can promise to try every day to earn your trust. Ava listened. Her eyes softened, but she didn't answer right away. She thought of Harlem, where her mother painted murals of hope, and her father taught her that love requires courage. Now James stood before her, not the untouchable CEO, but a man willing to lay his heart bare. But she needed time to believe he wouldn't rebuild the walls he had just broken down. I need time, Ava said finally, her voice gentle but unwavering. Not to punish you, but to be sure. I can't walk back into Sky Haven and pretend everything's fine. I must know that you won't retreat into contracts when emotions get messy. James nodded, disappointment flickering in his eyes, but also respect. I understand, he said. Take as much time as you need. I'll wait. He paused, then added, You showed me something I didn't know I was missing. I don't want to lose that. Ava smiled faintly, a smile, carrying both pain and possibility. She said she was coming here. Tearing up the contract meant something. It's a beginning. But beginnings aren't endings. James nodded, locking eyes with her. A beginning, he repeated as if the word was the most precious thing he'd ever been given. He turned to leave, but Ava called out, James. He stopped, looking back. Be careful driving home, she said softly. He truly smiled for the first time that day and headed back to his car. As he drove away from Lighthouse Point, Ava's final words echoed in his mind. A beginning. He thought of Sky Haven hollow without her and knew he had to change. Not just for Ava, but for himself. Ava sat back down on the bench and opened her journal. James came here, and for the first time, he was real. But I need certainty, not just with him, but with myself. Harlem taught me to rise, and I will, no matter where the road leads. She looked out to sea where the waves kept crashing, and felt a flicker of hope stir between the scars. The Sky Haven penthouse was no longer the cold glass museum it had once been when Ava Thompson, 28, a Black American woman, first moved in. The floor-to-ceiling windows still reflected the lights of Manhattan, but the space now bore signs of life. Books from both Ava and James mingled on the shelves. Maya's artwork hung proudly on the walls, and a warm, earth-toned rug covered the living room floor. James Carter, 34, a white American man and CEO of Carter Tech, had spent the past 2 weeks transforming the penthouse during Ava's absence, dismantling the physical and emotional barriers between the east and west wings. He was no longer building a fortress. He was building a home. When Ava returned unannounced, her access code still valid, she paused at the entrance, stunned by the change. "James." She called out, her voice echoing softly. He stepped out from what had once been his private office, now redesigned as a shared workspace, with two desks facing each other. His eyes lit up, surprised, hopeful, and just a little nervous at the sight of her. "Ava," he breathed. "You're here." "I'm here," she confirmed, her gaze sweeping the space. "What did you do to this place?" James said, that removed. James removed the walls that didn't need to be there, a line that meant more than just interior design. He stepped forward, but stopped short, respecting the invisible line Ava had drawn at Lighthouse Point. Ava nodded, recognizing his restraint. She said, "I came back to try," her voice soft but firm. "Not because I forgot what happened, but because I believe we can build something real. If we both try." James nodded, never taking his eyes off her. "I will try," he said, "every day." Reconciliation didn't come overnight. In the early days, they moved through Sky Haven like polite strangers, sharing meals, but maintaining emotional distance. Ava spent much of her time at the Meridian Institute with Maya, who has nearly recovered. She began teaching a part-time literature course at a local university, arranged through Eleanor Hayes. James restructured his schedule, making a point to be home in the evenings. He attempted dinner, his cooking still clumsy, but sincere. One night he burned the pasta. Ava laughed the first time since she returned. "Not bad for a CEO," she teased, her eyes softening. Moments like these, small but sincere, began to stitch them back together. One night, a power outage left the penthouse lit only by candles, echoing the night of the charity gala. They sat on the floor, wrapped in silence and flickering light. James spoke of his childhood without the armor of control for the first time. "My grandfather loved me, but his love always came with conditions," he said, voice low. "I learned never to need anyone, because needing meant being vulnerable." Ava reached across the candlelight and touched his hand. "Needing no one isn't living." "James," she whispered, "it's surviving. We can learn to need each other, not ideally, but together." She shared stories of Harlem, where she'd grown up among murals and poetry. Her mother painted hope. Her father taught her that love requires the courage to be hurt. "I'm scared of being hurt," she admitted, "but I'm here, because I see you, the real you, not just the CEO." Their growing reconciliation faced its most significant test at Carter Tech's quarterly presentation. With Ava's help, James crafted a pitch that merged complex numbers with authentic storytelling. Ava sat in the guest row, her eyes full of encouragement. But as the Q&A began, Claire Carter, James's cousin, entered the boardroom uninvited. Though recently ousted from the board for her prior scheme, she still carried venom behind her polished smile. "Impressive presentation," Cousin Claire said sweetly. "But I wonder, does the board know the truth about your contract marriage?" The room froze. All eyes turned to James. He stiffened. Instinct told him to retreat behind his familiar cold mask. But when he looked at Ava, calm, steady, believing in him, he found something deeper: courage. "The truth," he echoed, placing his notes aside. "The truth is, Ava is the most important person in my life. My grandfather's will required marriage not to uphold tradition, but to remind me that leadership isn't just numbers. It's about connection. Yes, we began with a contract, but what we have now goes far beyond paper. If the board wishes to judge me for being wise enough to recognize an extraordinary woman, so be it." Murmurs rippled through the room, uncertainty, surprise. But before anyone could speak, Eleanor Hayes stood holding an envelope. "This is the right moment," she said, voice steady. She pulled out a letter, written by James's grandfather, only to be opened once James had found someone who taught him to prioritize connection over control. James read it, emotion flickering behind his eyes. My grandfather wrote that Carter Tech needs a leader who values people, not just technology, James said. He even anticipated Claire might use the contract against me. He warned that ambition without purpose is never enough to lead. James turned to Claire, not with anger, but with clarity. I'm not here to fight you, Claire. I'm here to build something real. Flushed with humiliation and fury, Claire left without another word. After a moment of silence, the board applauded, confirming James's place not just as a CEO, but as a man who had finally learned to lead with heart. From the guest row, Ava smiled. Her eyes shimmered with pride. That night back at Sky Haven, Ava stepped into James's arms for the first time since her return. You chose us, she said softly before the company. It wasn't a risk, James whispered, holding her tight. It was realizing what truly matters. They stood on the balcony, city lights twinkling below them. Ava thought of Harlem, where she had learned how to rise, and now she was building a new home. Not just within Sky Haven, but in James's heart. And James, after a lifetime of isolation, knew that with Ava, he no longer had to live behind walls. The Harlem Community Library, a red brick building with arched windows, stood as the beating heart of the neighborhood, a place where poetry, art, and stories lived and breathed. In a small backyard garden, with twinkling lights and wildflowers. Ava Thompson, 28, a Black American woman, and James Carter, 34, a white American man, stood facing each other. Not at a lavish wedding, not under the shadow of a cold contract, but in a simple commitment ceremony, a moment where they chose one another, not through paper, but through love. Ava wore a sapphire blue dress reminiscent of the gala night they first met in public. Her mother's pearl earrings shimmered softly. James stood in a gray suit, no tie, looking more relaxed than ever. The steel blue of his eyes now radiated warmth. Only a few were present. Maya, Ava's 16-year-old sister, now nearly fully recovered. Eleanor Hayes, the Carter family lawyer, and Ms. Clara, the Harlem librarian, officiated the ceremony with a voice as warm as poetry. The garden was decorated with books, volumes of poetry by Langston Hughes and Toni Morrison, symbolizing the journey that had brought them here. We're not here to forge a new bond, Ms. Clara began, but to honor a connection that has already outgrown. Contracts outlasted doubt and become something etched in the heart. James took Ava's hands, his gaze never leaving hers. He set aside his prepared speech and spoke from the heart. Ava, when we started, I believed I could control everything: my company, my life, even my heart. I built walls so no one could see me hurt, but you saw me, you challenged me, and you left when I didn't deserve you. You taught me that love isn't control, it's courage. Today, I promise to choose you, not because of a contract, but because you are home. You're everything I didn't know I needed. Ava smiled, her eyes shining, but her voice was clear and strong, tinged with the lyricism of a scholar. James, I signed that contract for Maya thinking I was sacrificing my happiness. But you showed me that even the most impenetrable walls can hide the softest heart. You hurt me. But you also stood up, tore up the contract, and chose us. I promise to be patient with your journey, to believe in what we're building, and to choose love, messy, imperfect, but real. When Ms. Clara declared them partners in love and life, James and Ava kissed, not the technical kiss of a contract wedding, but a deep, quiet vow witnessed by those who mattered most. Maya clapped and shouted, "It took you long enough to pick the right guy." The crowd burst into laughter. The reception was held inside the library, nestled between old bookshelves. Maya gifted them a painting, Ava and James reading together in the Sky Haven living room. No more division between East and West wings. I call it Beyond the Contract. Maya grinned. It's cheesy but fitting for you two. Eleanor gave them a frame that held the shredded pieces of their original contract collected from Lighthouse Point, now preserved as a reminder. Some agreements need to be broken, she said, to build something more substantial. Later, James told Ava about his decision regarding Claire Carter. After her failed coup at the board meeting, she had confronted him in his office, arms crossed, eyes wary. Why, she asked, you could destroy me after what I did. James had looked at her not as an enemy, but as the cousin he once played with as a child. Because we both carry the weight of the Carter legacy, he said. I don't want to destroy you, Claire. I want you to find your purpose. He offered to help her launch a biotech startup, an arena where her talents could flourish. Claire, reluctant but surprised, eventually accepted, her expression softening. Ava's too good for you, she said, as she left without bitterness this time. Ava listened, proud, but not surprised. She said, you chose purpose over revenge, her hand gently sliding into his. That's the James I saw. Back at Skyhaven that night, they stood together on the balcony, city lights sparkling beneath them. So Ava teased from a contract to, this, do you think it was destiny? James pulled her close, smiling. Not destiny, he replied. A choice. I choose you, Ava, every day. He thought of his lonely childhood, where his grandfather had taught him that control was strength. But Ava had taught him that love is courage, the courage to be hurt, trust, and live. Ava leaned into him, thinking of Harlem, where she had learned to rise after loss. No contract could define us, she whispered. She thought of her parents, of Maya, and knew she had found her home not just in Skyhaven, but in James's heart. Maya, now healthy, was preparing to return to school and launch her hospital art exhibit with full support from the Carter Foundation. She texted Ava, you and James owe me pizza for getting you two together. Ava laughed and replied, deal. That evening, moonlight streamed through the glass walls and glowed across Maya's painting. James put on a Miles Davis vinyl. Jazz filled the room. He took Ava's hand, and together they danced slow, wordless, heart to heart. They didn't promise a perfect ending, but they promised this: to face the future together, not because of a contract, but because of a promise in their hearts.